Miss Marple and the Visitor Who Left Nothing. Chapter 1. It was the sort of morning St. Aldhelm's cherished. Sunlight spilled gently across cobblestones. The scent of lavender drifted lazily through open windows, and the village women fussed over sponge cakes and seed catalogues at the Thursday Garden Committee. The air was so quiet, so pleasant, that any passing stranger might have called it idyllic. But Miss Jane Marple knew better. She sat beneath the flowering wisteria on the vicarage terrace, a fine china cup resting between her fingers, though she hadn't yet sipped. Her blue eyes, sharp despite their age, were fixed on the garden gate. He was not expected. The man had arrived precisely at 10:30. He was tall, though not so tall as he carried himself, and wore a neat charcoal coat unsuited to the warming spring. He paused at the gate for a moment, as if uncertain whether to knock or disappear altogether, and then lifted the latch with a slow, deliberate motion. Miss Marple noted everything. His shoes were well polished but dusty. He had walked from the station then. His cuffs were starched, but his tie was crooked. A nervous man, possibly self-conscious, and most telling of all, he carried no bag, not even a newspaper under his arm. Only a single letter, folded crisply, visible in his inner pocket as the wind tugged at his lapel. He introduced himself as Mr. Giles Foster, a solicitor from London. "Oh, not of Foster and Bridgerton?" asked Reverend Hale, who had emerged with a tray of fresh currant scones. "No relation," Mr. Foster replied, quickly. "Just Foster. I'm here about a small matter concerning a parishioner. I wonder if we might speak inside." He smiled. It was a pleasant enough expression, civil, careful, but something about it didn't quite fit the moment. It was too rehearsed, too precisely placed, like a stage actor who had memorized every blink. Miss Marple remained quiet. She always did in such moments. Within 5 minutes, Mr. Foster and Reverend Hale disappeared into the vicarage study. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hale, bustled about with lemon curd and polite excuses, clearly curious but too proper to eavesdrop. Miss Marple, however, did not need to overhear. She watched the kitchen maid pass the study door 3 times more than necessary, and how the second-best tea set had been used, reserved for peculiar visitors or unpleasant business. It was nearly noon when the man left, walking briskly back the way he came, still without a single belonging. He had left behind no calling card, no papers, not even a biscuit crumb on the saucer, just a faint trace of cologne and unease. Later that evening, the village murmured with restrained curiosity. The vicar said little, except that it had been a rather delicate matter, and Mr. Foster would not be returning. That was the last time anyone in St. Aldhelm's saw him. 3 days later, the news arrived. Miss Felicity Arkwright, a reclusive widow who lived alone in the ivy-covered cottage near the green, was found dead in her drawing-room. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Bletchley, had arrived in the early morning to discover the fire had burned itself out. A teacup lay smashed on the rug, and Miss Arkwright's body slumped quietly in her armchair, as though she had simply fallen asleep. "A peaceful death," said the doctor. "A gentle heart failure in her sleep," he declared. "Not uncommon at her age." But there were small whispers, as there always were. The postmistress recalled Miss Arkwright receiving a strange letter the day before. The chemist noted she had not picked up her usual tonic that week, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Bletchley, tight-lipped and twitchy, insisted something was not quite right about the broken teacup. She never dropped things, she told Mrs. Hale in a hushed voice. Not even when she had that tremble in winter. And she always locked the back door at night, always. Yet the door had been unlatched that morning. Miss Marple, ever quiet, ever listening, simply nodded when Mrs. Hale relayed this over tea the next day. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Hale said, stirring cream into her cup. "And poor dear had no relatives, did she?" "None living," Miss Marple murmured. "Only an estranged niece, if I recall." Mrs. Hale tilted her head. "Is that so?" "Indeed. Estranged ever since that unpleasantness over the will. Quite some years ago now." They sipped in silence. No one in the village questioned the doctor's conclusion. The funeral was arranged, the cottage was to be locked, and the matter all but tucked away under the roses of village memory. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on one detail, the broken teacup. That, and the man who had come to the vicarage, who left behind nothing at all. Chapter 2. The bells of St. Aldhelm's tolled low and mellow across the village green, their sombre notes drifting past hedgerows and neat garden fences. Miss Felicity Arkwright had never married into great wealth, nor was she a figure of high society, yet her funeral was unusually well attended. Grief, in this case, was mingled with curiosity. They came in Sunday coats and pressed gloves, whispering into their scarves. She always seemed so particular. "Thought she'd go suddenly like that," murmured Mrs. Pendry, who had once borrowed a thimble from Miss Arkwright and never returned it. "Peaceful, they say," Mr. Cresswell added, with a respectful nod. "Still, can't help thinking. A bit sudden, wasn't it?" No one said more than they dared in public, but something unspoken trembled beneath the village's polite routine, the kind of tension Miss Marple had learned to recognize, like lace stretched just before it frays. At the front of the modest chapel, Mrs. Bletchley, the housekeeper, stood stiffly in black crape, her jaw locked with the effort of stillness. Her face betrayed nothing, but Miss Marple noted the slightest flinch as the Reverend mentioned a gentle departure from this world. Behind her, 2 pews back, Miss Lavinia Northcliffe, chairwoman of the Garden Society and self-appointed historian of village affairs, tilted her head sharply. "She was found with the back door open, you know," Lavinia whispered to Miss Durley, who nodded solemnly. "Careless in her final days, perhaps, or perhaps not." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the aisle, watched them all without appearing to. Her gaze flicked to the end of the pew, where Mr. Enderby, the retired solicitor, fidgeted with his hat in his lap. His fingers curled, then uncurled. 3 seats behind him sat young Ruth Calthorpe, Miss Arkwright's distant niece, barely 25, recently returned from Manchester after a prolonged absence. Ruth's eyes were dry. Her black dress, though respectable, bore the distinct creases of having been worn straight from a valise. After the service, as the mourners began to scatter, Miss Marple approached Ruth with gentle purpose. "My dear," she said, her voice warm with grandmotherly kindness, "I remember you from years ago, when you were just a slip of a thing. You used to climb that awful apple tree in your aunt's back garden." Ruth blinked. Yes, that was a long time ago. You disappeared from village life altogether. No word until now. I was studying, then working. My aunt and I, well, we didn't keep in touch. So I heard, Miss Marple said mildly. Still, one always comes back to family in the end, even when the tea has gone cold. Ruth gave a small, tight smile. She wrote to me last month, actually, first time in 5 years. Said she wanted to speak to me in person, but when I arrived yesterday morning, it was already too late. A strange coincidence, Miss Marple said gently. You must have been terribly shaken. I didn't know what to feel. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her eyes lingered, a moment longer before drifting back toward Mrs. Bletchley, who stood stiffly near the vicarage gate, speaking in low tones to Constable Rowan. By the following morning, the village was buzzing again, though not with talk of grief. No, death was only interesting when it hinted at something unfinished. At the post office, Mrs. Longmire leaned over the counter and whispered to anyone who would listen. She sent a telegram to someone in London the day before she died, marked urgent. I didn't see the content, of course, but she looked pale, shaken. Did she? Asked Mr. Cresswell, loitering over a licorice drop. What did she look like, exactly? Like a woman who knew something. At the grocer's, someone mentioned the vicar had been visited by a man from London just before the death. Wore a city coat, they say. Solicitor, or something shady like that. You know how those types are. Always coming round with bad news. And at the Red Hart pub that evening, a tipsy Mr. Enderby clinked his glass a little too loudly and said, I warned her. I did. She never listened. She was digging where she shouldn't have. No one asked what that meant, but Miss Marple, who did not frequent pubs, heard it all by supper, via Mrs. Price, whose daughter-in-law's second cousin worked at the bar. That same evening, she paid a quiet call on Mrs. Bletchley. The housekeeper answered the door with her apron still on, hair pulled into a no-nonsense knot. I'm sorry, Miss Marple, I'm not much for visitors today. I understand. I only meant to offer a bit of comfort, and perhaps share a few biscuits. I always find talking helps when the heart is troubled. Mrs. Bletchley hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the cottage bore the faint scent of lavender polish and burnt toast. The armchair remained untouched, the one where Miss Arkwright had been found. Her spectacles still sat on the table beside it, folded neatly. The absence of the woman hung in the air like a hush. Miss Marple offered a biscuit and asked no questions at first. Only after a long pause did she say, Your mistress, did she often leave the back door open at night? Never, came the quick reply, not even in summer. She was fussy about it, always checked the latch herself. Miss Marple stirred her tea, and the tea set, she said softly. Was it her usual? Mrs. Bletchley blinked. Well, yes, the blue and white, but the cup was smashed when I arrived. Was the saucer? No, just the cup. Funny thing, that. Yes, Miss Marple said. Funny. She rose after 10 more minutes, thanked the housekeeper, and promised to return with seed cuttings. As she stepped out into the fading light, she glanced once at the garden. A single row of daffodils had been trampled. The shape of a man's shoe, perhaps, or perhaps not. But something had passed through this place, briefly, and left no name, no trace, no purpose. Just silence and death. Chapter 3. It was 2 days after the funeral, when Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage with a small, parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with pale green string. Inside was a jar of quince jelly and a handwritten note addressed to Mrs. Hale. But the real purpose of her visit lay in the timing. She arrived just after midday, when the Reverend Hale's study door was known to be open, and the house was in, that lull between luncheon and tea. It was a habit she'd noted over many years, how the vicar, always precise, liked to sort his correspondence in the early afternoon while the housekeeper tended to her errands. Miss Marple waited patiently in the drawing-room while Mrs. Hale fetched her husband. When he entered, Miss Marple stood to greet him. "Only a brief visit, Vicar. I thought your dear wife might enjoy the jelly, and I hoped, just quietly, that I might trouble you with a small inquiry." Reverend Hale, a kindly man with a thinning fringe and an over-fondness for collecting novelty bookmarks, smiled wearily. "Ah, Miss Marple, you're always welcome, and your inquiries are rarely small." "I'll try to live up to that reputation," she said gently, taking the seat offered beside the fireplace. "You see, I've been turning over something. Curious. A visitor you received last week, Mr. Foster, I believe." The vicar's brow furrowed. "Oh, yes, a rather serious gentleman. Solicitor, I think." He gave no card. "No, quite right. Said he was dealing with a delicate inheritance matter. Mentioned Miss Arkwright, though not by name at first. Simply alluded to an elderly parishioner with a pending revision to her will." Miss Marple sipped the tea Mrs. Hale had brought in. "And did he mention what prompted the visit?" "Only that he needed to verify certain details with someone who had no vested interest. I suppose he meant me." "But he left nothing behind? Not a thing. He made a few notes on a small pad he kept in his pocket, but took them with him. Odd fellow. Polite, but uncomfortable in the room, if you understand me." "I do." The vicar hesitated, then added, "There was one thing that struck me after. He never mentioned Miss Arkwright by name until I did. I asked if it concerned her, and he simply nodded, as though that had been expected all along." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantel clock. "And now she's gone, quite suddenly." "Indeed," he said quietly. "The whole matter troubles me. I confess I had the impression the man came not to inquire, but to warn." She left soon after, with gracious thanks and a promise to return Mrs. Hale's embroidery magazine by Sunday. That afternoon the sun cast long shadows across the village green, and the Red Hart pub stood as a quiet refuge for those who preferred speculation to silence. Miss Marple, who did not frequent such establishments herself, happened to pass by just as Mr. Enderby was stepping out. She caught his eye with a mild smile. "Mr. Enderby, a moment if you've one to spare." He glanced up, wary at first, then softened. "Of course, Miss Marple. Lovely day, isn't it?" "Perfect for a walk," she said. "In fact, I often find a bit of conversation livens the path toward clarity." He chuckled. "Something on your mind?" "Oh, nothing urgent," she said lightly. "Only I heard you say something peculiar after the service about Miss Arkwright digging where she ought not." Mr. Enderby shifted on his feet. "Did I say that?" "You did. And I've always admired your memory for old matters, particularly the legal ones." He rubbed his chin. "She asked me for advice about 2 weeks ago. Came to me in the churchyard of all places. Said she had reason to believe someone had altered a will improperly. Wanted to know how one could tell. Did she mention whose will? No, but she was quite firm in her belief. Said the change had been recent and sudden. She asked if an unsigned draft could be enforced under any conditions. And what did you say? That without a signature it's nothing. The law is very clear on that. Miss Marple gave a small nod. And did she seem frightened? Mr. Enderby looked away. Yes, though she didn't say it in so many words. She seemed afraid she'd waited too long. That evening, as the lamplighter's passed through the village and windows glowed warm against the dusk, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk. Her lace curtains fluttered in the breeze, and the sounds of the village faded into that still hush she valued most. She opened a small drawer and withdrew an envelope she'd been keeping since the morning after the funeral. It contained a folded note, a page torn from a pocket journal. It had been given to her discreetly by a boy from the station who ran errands for the chemist. He'd found it in the hedgerow just beyond Miss Arkwright's property. The handwriting was hurried, blotted but readable. Not safe to speak openly. We'll bring the original next week. Until then, destroy any copies. He suspects already. G. Just that. No more. No address. No full name. Just the single initial and a sense of breathless urgency. Miss Marple smoothed the paper flat. It had not been written by Miss Arkwright. That much was clear, and yet it seemed to connect to her somehow. She glanced out the window at the garden below. The daffodils still leaned where the earth had been disturbed. No new footprints, no return. And still, no one in the village could say who Mr. Foster had truly been, or what he had carried in his mind, or his pocket, when he came and went without a trace. But Miss Marple felt it now, like a stitch pulling too tight in the fabric of something carefully made. The truth was there, not loud, not obvious, but ready to be unpicked. Chapter 4. The following morning, a constable knocked on the door of Ivy Cottage. Miss Marple, already seated at her writing table with her morning correspondence, set down her pen and called softly, "Come in, dear. You'll let the chill in if you hover too long." Constable Rowan entered with the apologetic stiffness of a man uncertain of his purpose. He removed his cap and looked sheepish. "Sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple. Just a matter of official inquiry, you understand. Superintendent Pike is looking to gather some village statements. In light of, well, recent events." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "You must have a great many doorstep visits to make." Rowan sighed. "Too many, and none of them all that eager to speak plainly." He hesitated. "There's been a development, you see. Superintendent Pike's received word from Manchester. The niece, Miss Ruth Calthorpe. Her arrival timings raised some questions." "Has it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "She arrived in St. Aldhelm's the morning Miss Arkwright was found. Claims she was summoned by letter, but no such letter's been found in the house. No postmark, no note among the papers, nothing." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. Rowan nodded. "Pike thinks perhaps she arrived a day earlier than she says. Maybe even spoke with her aunt. And if there was a quarrel, then it might explain a motive," Miss Marple offered gently. Rowan gave a tight smile. "Exactly that. Ruth's been rather cool about the whole affair. Polite, but distant. And you know how the village talks." "I do, indeed. And what does the village say?" "That Miss Arkwright changed her will." Rowan glanced up, gauging her reaction. but Miss Marple simply reached for a currant bun. She had no other living relatives, he continued. Ruth would have inherited everything. But Pike thinks perhaps Miss Arkwright had a change of heart, decided to leave it elsewhere. That would explain the solicitor, wouldn't it? It would, Miss Marple agreed, though that presumes the solicitor was legitimate. Rowan blinked. You think he wasn't? I think he left no card, no copy of his credentials, and no trace of his visit apart from memory. That's a rather thin signature for a man of legal affairs. Rowan scratched the back of his neck. I hadn't thought of that. Miss Marple smiled. Most don't. By the time Rowan left, half the village had already whispered its conclusion. The niece did it. She'd always been distant, they said. She hadn't visited in years. She came the very day her aunt died and left without a tear. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Longmire said as much to Lavinia Northcliffe, who promptly relayed it to the butcher, who relayed it to his wife, who relayed it to Mrs. Hale by the time the church bells rang noon. Ruth, meanwhile, had taken up temporary lodging in the guest room of the vicarage. She wandered through the village with the air of someone not quite sure where she belonged. She did not dress in black, but in a sensible grey, and when asked about her plans, she simply said she would see the matter through, then return north. Miss Marple found her seated on a bench near the war memorial the following afternoon, staring out across the green with a peculiar stillness. "My dear," she said kindly, "I wonder if I might join you." Ruth nodded without looking up. "You're welcome too." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind push through the hedgerows. "I'm sorry," Ruth said at last, "about all this. People think I came for money." "And did you?" Ruth turned to her, startled. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "I don't ask to judge, only to understand." Ruth hesitated. "I came because my aunt wrote to me. She said she was frightened. She said someone had come into her home asking questions. She didn't name him, but said she felt watched. I took the night train. I arrived early, walked to the house. The constable was already there. No one's found the letter," Miss Marple said softly. "She told me not to bring it, said it might put me in danger." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. That was thoughtful of her. Ruth looked down. She wasn't a kind woman, Miss Marple. She was clever, private, and proud, but she wouldn't lie about being afraid. "I believe you," Miss Marple said. And she did, but belief and proof rarely walked hand in hand. That evening word spread that Superintendent Pike had begun drafting a formal inquiry into Ruth's movements. An inquest would be opened to determine the cause of death, pending toxicology results, which, in a case of suspected poison, were standard procedure. The idea caught like dry grass to flame. Mrs. Northcliffe arranged a special meeting of the Audiobook Garden Society, ostensibly to discuss spring plantings, but in truth to dissect Ruth's behaviour. Mrs. Bletchley was notably absent. The doctor, who'd confirmed the heart failure, was suddenly more cautious in his remarks. And Mr. Enderby, who had once called Ruth a sharp little thing, now spoke of her unfortunate temperament. Only Miss Marple sat apart from the whole swirl of conclusions. She knew the truth rarely stood where fingers pointed first. Ruth might be lying, or not. But Miss Arkwright had been frightened, and a man, real or not, had visited the vicar with veiled warnings, Someone had trampled the daffodils, and someone had left behind no name, no trace, and no memory, save a vague unease. The real answer, she felt, did not sit plainly in Ruth's cold expression or the village's shifting gossip. It waited beneath the noise, and someone, whoever they were, had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed buried. Chapter 5. 3 days after Miss Arkwright's funeral, the cottage on Tansy Lane remained locked and silent. Ivy had begun to creep across the garden gate again, and a stray tabby cat sat sunning itself on the stone stoop as if the past week had been entirely unremarkable. But Miss Marple did not believe in unremarkable weeks, not in St. Aldhelm's. She walked with a wicker basket over her arm, apparently on her way to collect jam jars from Mrs. Pembroke, but slowed as she reached the cottage. A man stood just beyond the fence, tall, wiry, with grey at his temples and a small notebook in hand. Superintendent Pike. He didn't look like he belonged in a village. His boots were too polished, his coat too city-worn. And yet he leaned on, the gait like a man deep in country thought. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a nod. "I rather expected you." "Oh," she asked pleasantly. "Word gets around. You're the sort that appears near trouble. Not in it, mind you, but hovering just enough to make sense of it." Miss Marple smiled. "Well, trouble does have a way of cropping up when people don't look closely enough." Pike tapped the notebook with his pen. "I've been looking, and something's bothering me. You may be interested." She waited. "We examined the teacup again," Pike said. "The one found smashed beside the chair. The doctor said no poison was detected in what remained, but I found something else. Faint residue under the handle. Soap, not tea. The housekeeper swore she'd washed the cups the night before. But this one had been rinsed, not washed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Someone made tea," Pike went on, "but cleaned the cup quickly, deliberately. Not the way you do when you're simply tidying up. Something more careful, more precise." "You believe it was planted?" she asked quietly. "I think someone meant for us to believe it was used, but it wasn't. Not for drinking, at any rate." Miss Marple considered that. "So the poison, if there was any, wasn't in the cup?" "Possibly not," Pike said. "But then what? The fire was out. There was no glass, no food, nothing in her system except the usual medicine. But it happened too quickly. Sudden collapse, yes, but she wasn't frail. No history of heart failure. No stress leading up to it. People don't just fall asleep mid-sentence and never wake up. Unless someone wanted it to look that way." Pike nodded grimly. They stood in companionable silence, watching the cottage as if it might speak. Then Miss Marple said, "There was a diary." Pike raised an eyebrow. "Miss Arkwright kept one for years," she continued. "Not a journal of feelings, just notes, day-to-day matters. She often mentioned it to Mrs. Hale when comparing planting seasons. A rather precise record-keeper was Felicity." "We didn't find any diary," Pike said. "No, I rather thought not," Miss Marple murmured, "because whoever visited, her last, didn't want anyone to read it." That afternoon, Pike arranged for another search of the cottage. This time, he brought a junior officer from the county and instructed them to look for anything out of place, particularly in the study. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned home and retrieved a notebook of her own, a small leather-bound ledger in which she kept records of her rose blooms, seed swaps, and, when needed, timelines of unusual deaths. She wrote, April 2nd, solicitor, Giles Foster, visits vicar, no proof of identity, claims legal matter involving Miss Arkwright, leaves no trace. April 3rd, Miss Arkwright seen at post, office, telegram sent to unknown recipient, looks unwell. April 4th, Ruth Calthorpe arrives, Miss Arkwright found dead. No visible signs of struggle. Broken teacup, no poison in residue. Cup cleaned, not washed. Diary missing. Solicitor vanished. Motive if murder. Will revision. New heir, threatened secret. She stared at the last line. The solicitor, or whoever had impersonated him, had known something, or suspected it. The diary might have confirmed it, and yet, why come at all if the purpose was simply to remove evidence? Why not steal it quietly? No, the visitor had wanted something from Miss Arkwright, something only she had. The diary was an afterthought, an erasure. Later that evening, Ruth came to call. She looked pale, her hands shoved into her coat pockets, hair pulled back without care. They questioned me again, she said, sitting stiffly in Miss Marple's parlour. Pike thinks I came early. Thinks I argued with her. Maybe I did. I don't remember every word. Miss Marple offered tea. Ruth declined. What did you say to her? Miss Marple asked gently. Ruth stared at the carpet. I asked her why. Why she sent for me after all these years. Why now? She said she didn't trust her own mind any more. That someone had made her doubt herself. I thought she meant the solicitor. But maybe it was more. Did she mention a diary? Ruth's head jerked up. Yes, she said it was the only thing she could trust. That she'd written everything down. She wanted to show me, but we didn't get that far. Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. When Ruth left, Miss Marple returned to her ledger and added a final line beneath the others. The diary held the answer, and someone knew it. She placed a red ribbon between the pages and closed the book. Whoever the visitor was who left nothing behind had overlooked one thing. A cup can be cleaned, a letter burned, a diary taken, but intention leaves a shape, a gap in the pattern, and it is the shape, not the substance, that tells you what's missing. Chapter 6. By the week's end, the death of Miss Felicity Arkwright no longer hung over St. Aldhelm's like a storm cloud. It had instead seeped into the soil, woven itself into whispered exchanges and guarded glances. The sort of slow, spreading rot that never announced itself, but lingered all the same. It wasn't grief that held the village in its grip. It was watchfulness, and it was clearest that Thursday afternoon at the Ladies' Embroidery Circle. They met, as they always did, in the church hall, surrounded by stiff cushions, silver tins of barley sweets, and the faint scent of mothballs. Needles clicked against fabric, while conversations folded themselves into murmurs, half-thoughts, almost confessions. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, quietly embroidering violets on linen. Her eyes, though focused, missed nothing. "You know," said Mrs. Northcliffe, her voice lowered to a stage whisper, "I always said Felicity was far too clever with her bookkeeping. Not healthy to keep track of everything. Makes one suspicious, doesn't it?" Mrs. Durley looked up from her needlepoint. "She once corrected the postmistress on a sixpence discrepancy. 3 years after it happened. Imagine!" "Well," sniffed Miss Prowse, "I heard she'd been asking odd questions in the week, before she died, poking around about wills, of all things." Miss Marple didn't look up, but filed it away. That made 3 separate mentions of Miss Arkwright's sudden interest in legal matters, and each version slightly different. Then came the more curious part. Mrs. Larkin, who rarely said anything unless prompted, leaned forward suddenly. "She came to me as well, the day before she died. Asked about a gentleman who'd visited the mill house recently. That stilled the room." "What gentleman?" "What?" asked Miss Prowse. Mrs. Larkin frowned. "Tall, greying, wore a neat coat, claimed to be interested in renting the place, said he had friends nearby. I thought nothing of it." "And did he give a name?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "No." Mrs. Larkin hesitated, but he asked odd questions. Wanted to know who owned the adjoining cottages. Asked after Miss Arkwright by name. There was a pause as the weight of that settled in. "So he wasn't a solicitor?" Mrs. Northcliffe asked. Mrs. Larkin looked uncertain. "If he was, he didn't say so. He acted more like someone checking boundaries. A property surveyor, maybe." Miss Marple's hands never stopped moving, but her mind had begun piecing together the edges of a shape, something not yet visible, but undeniably present. That evening, she stopped by the vicarage with a potted foxglove for Mrs. Hale and a casual inquiry for the Reverend. "Tell me, Vicar," she said once the pleasantries were exchanged, "do you recall whether Mr. Foster, the man who came to see you, mentioned why he believed Miss Arkwright's will was being changed?" "He didn't specify," Reverend Hale replied. "He hinted that Miss Arkwright had been influenced, that she'd reversed certain provisions rather suddenly." "Reversed? Not merely amended?" "That was the word he used. Reversed." Miss Marple tapped the edge of her teacup. So someone had once been written out, and then restored. The vicar nodded. Something like that. She left soon after, but not before noticing the hesitation in Mrs. Hale's smile as she said goodbye. A polite woman, Mrs. Hale, too polite to say what she knew, but perhaps uneasy at what she was beginning to suspect. Miss Marple took a longer path home, walking through the lanes just as the sky dipped into indigo. The scent of lilac was thick in the hedges. From a distance, she saw Ruth Calthorpe standing alone near the chapel gate, arms folded against the chill. Miss Marple approached with soft steps. "You oughtn't be out without a coat, my dear," she said gently. Ruth turned, startled. "Couldn't sleep." "You've been thinking," Miss Marple said, not unkindly, "about your aunt." "She wasn't close with anyone," Ruth murmured, "but somehow everyone seems to think they knew her best." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's how it is in a village. Familiarity wears many disguises." Ruth looked away. "Did she tell anyone about the inheritance, I think?" Miss Marple said slowly. "She may have told the wrong person, or rather, someone who already knew." Ruth blinked. How could they? Perhaps they had a copy of the old will, or perhaps they were counting on the new one being destroyed before it could matter. She said she'd signed it. The new one. And if that's true, someone may be looking for it still. Ruth shivered. "There's something I haven't said," she admitted after a moment. "I went into her study when I arrived. Before the constable saw me, I looked for the letter she sent me. I didn't find it, but I did find something strange." She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a slip of yellowing paper. This was tucked into the pages of her hymn book. "I thought it might be private, but it's not addressed to anyone." Miss Marple accepted the paper carefully. It was a list, short, in tidy handwriting. 3 names: Calthorpe J. Enderby, G. Foster, and beside them, in pencil, "Who do I trust?" Miss Marple said nothing, but in her mind the pattern was forming at last. Not a matter of what was added to the story, but what had been quietly removed. A forged identity. A name planted and withdrawn. A diary gone. A will, revised perhaps, hidden. And 3 names. Trust, after all, was always the rarest currency in murder. Chapter 7. It was the postmistress, Mrs. Longmire, who found it first. On a mist-veiled Saturday morning, just before opening the shutters of the village post office, she noticed the brass lock on the side door hanging crooked. The frame bore a jagged splinter, as though it had been forced open some time during the night. But nothing appeared stolen. No coins disturbed, no parcels rifled through. Just a single envelope left conspicuously on the counter, as though someone wanted it to be found. Mrs. Longmire, never one to delay drama, fetched Constable Rowan before the kettle had even boiled. By midday, the envelope was in Superintendent Pike's hands. The handwriting on the front was deliberate and unfamiliar. It bore no postage, no return address, just a name in looping ink. Miss Marple, Private Pike, brought it to Ivy Cottage himself. "I'd normally call this irregular," he said as she met him at the door, "but this case hasn't followed a single rule yet." Miss Marple accepted the envelope without ceremony, though her fingers paused briefly on the seal before breaking it open. Inside was a folded page, yellowed slightly at the edges, typed. The kind of type that bore faint misalignments. A crooked E, a high Et. The note read, "You're asking the wrong questions." Arkwright knew what she was doing. The will doesn't matter. It was never about the money. Check the chapel records. Easter, 1993. No signature, no salutation, no threats. Just a message aimed directly at her, and by extension, the quiet web of deduction she'd begun to weave. Superintendent Pike hovered by the hearth, arms folded. "What do you make of it?" Miss Marple reread the note once, then again. Someone wants to redirect attention, or possibly correct it. It was never about the money. That could be true, or a mislead. And the chapel records? They've kept meticulous logs for decades, she said, mostly birth and burial entries. But occasionally the vicar notes special events, donations, confessions, odd requests. Pike nodded. "I'll have a look." But Miss Marple had already risen, her movements brisker than usual. "No need. Reverend Hale will be expecting my next jar of lemon curd, and he's never declined help in reorganizing the archives." The chapel was dim and pleasantly musty, the scent of old hymnals and floor polish lingering in the pews. In the vestry, Reverend Hale greeted her with a warm, if puzzled, smile. "My dear Miss Marple, twice in 1 week. What a blessing!" "I've come to ask about Easter," she said softly. "Of 1993. The vicar blinked. "Goodness, that's years ago. Let me see. Those logs are in the older cabinet." They worked in quiet companionship, lifting old folios and tracing through brittle parchment until the relevant year surfaced. Reverend Hale squinted at the narrow lines, then paused. "Ah, here it is, Easter Sunday." Miss Marple leaned in. The entry was concise, in the vicar's own handwriting. Special donation received for installation of new altar cloths, Miss F. Arkwright. Private appointment scheduled, confessional, visitor, G.F. No details recorded at subject's request. G.F., Miss Marple whispered. Giles Foster? The vicar shook his head. He wasn't a parishioner. In fact, I don't recall the name before now. Do you recall the meeting? I remember it being peculiar. Miss Arkwright insisted on arranging it. Said the man had something he wished to confess, but only to her present. Very unusual. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. And afterward? They both left together. She seemed agitated. Agitated how? He considered. Not afraid, resolved. As if something had been decided. I never asked. I was told not to. By Sunday morning, word had spread that the post office had been broken into, though naturally the details had grown legs. Some claimed a stack of money had vanished. Others insisted a coded message had been left scrawled on the mirror in soap. Miss Marple let the rumours swirl. Instead, she visited Mr. Enderby. The retired solicitor greeted her at the door with his usual gruff civility. But when she mentioned Easter 1993, his expression shifted. That long ago, he muttered, retreating into the drawing-room. Why does it matter now? I believe the man who claimed to be Giles Foster had a previous connection to Miss Arkwright, possibly through a private legal matter. Mr. Enderby exhaled sharply. There was something. She came to me shortly after that Easter, wanted to create a sealed codicil, refused to tell me what it contained, said it had to remain unopened unless she died under suspicious circumstances. Miss Marple straightened. Did she ever revoke it? No, but she never signed it either, said she'd wait and see. And where is that document now? In my safe, he admitted. Still sealed? She fixed him with a gentle but steady look. I believe it's time to open it. He hesitated, then nodded. The envelope was unremarkable, unaddressed, untitled, sealed with plain wax. Inside was a single page, handwritten, no date. Should I die under unclear or unnatural circumstances, I wish it known that Giles Foster confessed to me his role in the death of my sister, Clara Arkwright, in 1987. I kept it secret at the time. I know, longer can, F.A. Miss Marple sat back, eyes narrowed in thought. The past had reached forward. What had once been buried in private guilt had become motive in the present. A man desperate to keep a confession from surfacing. A woman finally ready to speak. And now, both silent. Miss Marple folded the page carefully and handed it back. It was never about the money, she said aloud. Superintendent Pike would need to see this, but she was certain of one thing. Miss Arkwright had not simply died of fear. She had died because of it. Chapter 8. The sealed confession, once opened, changed everything. And yet, officially, it changed nothing. Superintendent Pike reviewed the document in Miss Marple's parlour with the guarded scepticism of a man who had been burned before. No legal force, he muttered, tapping the page with the back of his pen. It's a personal statement. No signature, no witnesses. doesn't name the circumstances of the alleged death, but it does name the man," Miss Marple replied, her voice as gentle as ever. "And if Giles Foster returned to the village under false pretences, as we suspect, then his presence at the time of Miss Arkwright's death cannot be coincidental." Pike's jaw flexed. "We don't even know if that's his real name." "No," she agreed, "but we do know he feared something. Enough to silence her." Pike exhaled. "We have no proof he was here." "You do," Miss Marple said softly. "You just haven't looked for it yet." He blinked. "Where?" She leaned back in her chair. "Ask the chemist about his visitor's book." That afternoon, Pike did just that. And there, buried 2 pages deep, was a pencilled entry from April the 2nd. G. Farrow. Inquiry drew. Prescription records. Miss Arkwright. Farrow, not Foster. It was enough. Pike launched a formal inquiry, sending a request to the London Metropolitan Police for records matching the alias and possible background of Giles Farrow, now confirmed as the man who impersonated a solicitor and was last seen near Miss Arkwright's home. But Miss Marple wasn't satisfied with waiting. She had observed something subtle over the past week, something not in what people said, but in what they avoided, and one of those people was Mr. Enderby. On the surface, he had been forthcoming. He had handed over the sealed confession, admitted to drafting the codicil, even expressed concern about the circumstances surrounding Miss Arkwright's death. But Miss Marple knew the language of omission. It wasn't only what he had shared, but when. She decided at last to set her own test. That evening she sent a note. It was handwritten in her tidy script, delivered by a village boy just after supper. It read, "I have found Miss Arkwright's diary. It confirms everything. I'll need your help tomorrow before I take it to Pike. J.M." She did not name which diary. She did not explain what everything meant, but she knew precisely who would respond to it and how. The next morning, the trap was laid. Miss Marple asked Ruth to take tea with her at the vicarage garden, while Pike and Constable Rowan waited, out of sight, in the library of Ivy Cottage. Mrs. Hale, bless her, had agreed to be an innocent presence nearby, should anyone ask. Miss Marple left the front door slightly ajar and placed a decoy, an aged leather-bound book from her father's old trunk, on the parlour table, tucked just beneath a tea-towel, a diary to the casual eye. She settled herself across the lane on a garden bench, ostensibly discussing flowering currants with Ruth, but with a clear line of sight to her window. At precisely 3:30, someone tried the front gate. Miss Marple made no movement, but she noted the figure. Not Pike, not Rowan, Mr. Enderby. He paused at the door, knocked once, and when no one answered, entered. 5 minutes later, Pike followed him inside. It wasn't until nearly 4 o'clock that it occurred. Miss Marple rose and re-entered her home. She found Mr. Enderby seated stiffly in the parlour, hands clasped on his knees. The diary, untouched, remained precisely where she'd left it. Pike stood behind him, arms crossed. Enderby didn't look up. "I thought you might come," Miss Marple said softly. He spoke without turning. "I saw her, you know, the day before. She died." Miss Marple took her seat across from him. Why didn't you say?" "Because I suspected then, and still do, that if I'd told you, I'd be blamed." "Were you involved?" He hesitated. "Not in the way you think. I warned her. I told her not to trust Farrow. She said she no longer did. She said she was planning to tell someone, likely you." Miss Marple studied him closely. "So you knew about the sister?" He nodded. "Farrow and Clara were involved years ago. I never knew the full story. Only that Clara died, strangely, and Farrow disappeared." "And yet you didn't warn anyone when he returned?" "I wasn't sure it was him. Not at first, and by the time I was, Felicity was dead." Pike broke in. "Then why enter Miss Marple's home today?" "I thought," he faltered, "I thought the diary might accuse me. I thought she might have blamed me for staying silent." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But you did stay silent, Mr. Enderby, and that silence gave Farrow time." He bowed, his head. It wasn't a confession of guilt, but it was a confession of failure. A moral abdication, if not a criminal one. When Pike led him out, it was without cuffs. Not yet, but his role would be examined. As for Giles Farrow, confirmation arrived the next day. A man matching his description had boarded a train to Exeter under a different name. He was still missing. But now there was a name, a face, a motive. And Miss Marple, watching the village slip slowly back into its rhythms, knew the game was nearly over. Only one move remained. Chapter 9. Monday morning came with a soft drizzle that muted the sounds of the village. St. Aldhelm's wore the grey sky like an old shawl, frayed, familiar, and heavy with waiting. At Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple set out 2 cups on a lace-covered table, polished the silver sugar tongs, and arranged her embroidery just so, everything in its place. She had sent only one invitation that morning. Ruth Calthorpe arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, rain dampening the shoulders of her coat. Her face, drawn and pale, held the weary tightness of someone expecting judgment, or something worse. "You asked for me," she said softly. "I did," Miss Marple replied, ushering her in with grandmotherly calm. "Come sit, dear. The tea's just brewed." They sat together in the quiet. For a long while, neither spoke. Rain tapped gently against the window panes. A clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Then Miss Marple said, "I received a letter some days ago. It mentioned the chapel records, Easter 1993. Ruth's eyes flicked up. "Did you find something?" "I did. A man, Giles Farrow, came to the village then. He met with your aunt and the vicar, and he confessed something dark, something your aunt recorded privately but never acted upon." Ruth exhaled slowly. "My mother always said Aunt Felicity held grudges. But this, it wasn't a grudge, was it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It was guilt, regret. She buried what she knew for years. But guilt is a seed, my dear. It grows even in silence." "She told me she was afraid," Ruth said quietly, "that someone from the past had returned. She didn't say who, but she asked me to come. She said there were things she could no longer carry alone. And yet she died before she could share them." Ruth looked down at her hands. "You think he killed her?" "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Giles Farrow, using the name Foster learned she had changed her mind, that she had written something, that she might speak. She never said the name. She didn't need to. She feared him, but she didn't panic. She planned. She summoned you. She began putting things in order, only she didn't do it fast enough. Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then, what now? Miss Marple reached beneath the tea-towel on the sideboard and brought out the single page, the sealed confession Miss Arkwright had written years ago. She laid it gently between them. Pike now knows who to look for. The warrant is coming. They'll find him. Perhaps not today, but soon. He's made mistakes, more than one. Ruth stared at the page. Do you think he knew she'd written this? I think he suspected. That's why he came. That's why he searched. That's why he left nothing behind. Miss Marple's voice lowered. But people like Mr. Farrow always overlook something. They erase documents, but not the fear in someone's eyes. They clean cups, but leave footprints in a garden bed. And they never, ever expect people to talk. There was a pause. May I ask, Miss Marple continued gently, why you truly came back? Ruth hesitated. Then, because I had questions, not about the will, about my mother. Clara Arkwright died in a fall, down a stairwell. The police called it misadventure, but I always thought it was odd. She wasn't clumsy, she didn't drink, and no one ever explained why she'd been arguing with a man on the night she died. You believe it was him? I do. I think Aunt Felicity knew the truth, and I think she lived with that weight for years. Miss Marple nodded. Then perhaps this was never about inheritance at all. Ruth looked away. I didn't want to do anything from her. I only wanted to know. And now you do. They sipped their tea in silence. The rain began to ease. When Ruth stood to leave, Miss Marple said one last thing. You know, your aunt left no official will on file. The last, signed version, the one in her solicitor's possession, named you as sole heir. Ruth blinked. But the new one was never signed. She waited too long. So whether you intended it or not, the estate is yours. I don't know what to do with that. Miss Marple's smile was faint but kind. Perhaps start by doing what your aunt didn't. Tell the truth. Speak plainly. Let no more silence be your family's legacy. Ruth nodded slowly, then left without another word. That afternoon Pike returned with a telegram in hand. Metropolitan Police confirmed the alias. He said, Giles Farrow has used at least 3 identities over the past decade. Financial, fraud, 1 sealed case involving coercion, and now possibly murder. Miss Marple didn't look surprised. He's still missing? For now. But his name is out. And once a name is out, people stop helping you hide. Miss Marple glanced at the hearth. There's one thing I still don't understand, Pike admitted. Why return at all? Why risk it? If Farrow knew Miss Arkwright might speak, why not stay gone? Because people like him, Miss Marple said softly, believe they can always rewrite the past. That cleverness outpaces consequence. And sometimes it does, Pike murmured. Until it doesn't, she replied. That evening, she returned to her notebook. Under the final entry, she added just 3 more words. He came back, not for the money, not for the will, but to Silence the only person who could connect him to a death long forgotten by law, but not by memory. Now, that memory had spoken, and the village, for all its gossip and forgetfulness, would remember. Chapter 10. The skies cleared by Wednesday morning, revealing a pale blue that seemed to wash the village clean. The scent of damp earth rose from the garden beds, and Miss Marple, seated once again in the quiet of her parlour, began to write. Not letters, not yet, but reflections. She had always found comfort in order, and now that the pieces had been laid bare, they needed arranging into something complete, something final. She heard the knock at the door just after 11, 3 polite taps. Superintendent Pike entered with a folder under one arm, and a fresh look of gravity drawn across his face. "We've located him," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Giles Farrow, or should I say Harold Glenister, which appears to be his real name, was detained in Exeter under suspicion of identity fraud. Once they ran his prints, the rest followed quickly. Miss Marple set her pen aside, and Miss Arkwright's death. Pike lowered himself into the armchair opposite her. Pending toxicology confirmation, but preliminary results suggest digitalis poisoning. Small dose. Slipped into her evening tonic, not the teacup. The cleaning of the cup was a diversion. Miss Marple nodded. He needed the death to appear natural, quick, and without disturbance. The tonic was perfect, routine, unmonitored. Pike opened the folder. We recovered a false solicitor's card in his possession, matching the alias he used here. No diary was found, but he had a letter, addressed to himself, written in Miss Arkwright's hand, likely intercepted. It references their meeting in 1993 and her intent to speak out. That, I believe, was the trigger. Miss Marple looked toward the garden, where sparrows flitted between the hedge. She was no longer content to carry silence, but she underestimated how far he would go. She should have gone straight to the police. She was a woman raised in a generation that didn't place faith in institutions, not when shame and secrets were involved. She tried to do the right thing in the only way she knew, privately. Pike was quiet a moment, then said, "Can I ask, when did you know?" Miss Marple poured them both tea. "I began to suspect when I noticed the absence of things," she said. "No card left behind, no notes, no trace. It's very difficult, Superintendent, to leave nothing behind, not in a village like this. And the diary. I never found it, but the fact that it wasn't found, that told me it existed. Miss Arkwright was methodical. She didn't misplace things. If her records disappeared, someone took them deliberately." Pike nodded slowly. The old confession, the names, the initials. "Those gave the shape," Miss Marple said. "But it was the cup that told me he was clever, and the trampled daffodils that told me he was careless. A man who stages a scene so carefully rarely stops to think about the mud on his shoes." Pike allowed himself the faintest smile. "You've done more for this case than I'd like to admit." "Credit is not my currency, Superintendent," Miss Marple replied lightly. "I'm more interested in closure." Pike stood. "The Crown will move forward with charges, fraud, identity theft, and if the full toxicology holds, manslaughter at the very least, and the death of Clara Arkwright. A new inquiry will be opened. Glenister's name is now tied to 2 deaths. It'll be difficult for him to wriggle free a third time. Miss Marple nodded and saw him out. She returned to her seat and picked up her notebook once more. L'Education entry was neat and final. He cleaned the teacup, not to erase poison, but to manufacture misdirection. He took the diary, not for information, but for silence. He returned under a new name, thinking no one would connect the past to the present. He was wrong. That evening Ruth returned. She entered quietly, carrying an envelope. "I've spoken with the solicitor in London," she said. "I'm setting aside the inheritance. It feels stained. I'll use it to restore the chapel and donate the rest to a trust for women's advocacy." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing. After a pause, Ruth added, "I don't think my aunt ever forgave herself. For the silence, for not protecting my mother." "She tried to make amends," Miss Marple said gently. "In her own way. She brought you back. That mattered. She was never the affectionate type." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but intention often speaks louder than tone. She trusted you with her last hope. That's a form of love." They had tea again, and Ruth lingered long enough to ask about the foxgloves in the window. Then she left, walking slowly down the lane as dusk settled in. Miss Marple watched her go. The village had returned to its quiet rhythm. The toll of the church bell, the rustle of hedgerows, the clatter of a cart down the far road. But beneath it all was a shift, subtle, irreversible. Another secret laid bare, another story rewritten not with violence, but with observation. Miss Marple, alone now, sipped her cooling tea and murmured to herself, "People always say nothing happens in the village. But the truth is, everything happens here, just quietly." In the end, it is always the quiet that reveals the truth. Chapter 11. The following week passed quietly, but the quiet was different now. Weighted, measured, a kind of hush had settled over St. Aldhelm's, not from fear, but from the sort of reflection that lingers in the wake of something terrible finally given a name. Giles Farrow, Harold Glenister, was behind bars awaiting formal charges. The newspapers had picked up the story with cautious interest, reporting on an unfolding case in the English countryside involving a falsified identity and a long-buried confession. They didn't mention Miss Marple. They never did. But the village knew. They always knew. At the vicarage, the Reverend Hale stood before a half-empty pew on Sunday morning and gave a sermon on the weight of silence. His words were careful, thoughtful, shaped as much by what he didn't say as what he did. And when he closed with, "Let not guilt remain hidden in the name of peace," even Mrs. Northcliffe looked down at her gloves. After the service, Ruth Calthorpe lingered at the church gate, answering polite nods and murmured condolences with quiet grace. Her presence was no longer met with suspicion, but it wasn't comfort either. It was something else. Distance, perhaps. An unspoken agreement between her and the village that certain things were better left unrepeated. Miss Marple watched it, all from the side garden, a crocheted shawl around her shoulders, the spring breeze tugging at the hem. She didn't need to be part of the conversations. She had heard what mattered. Later that afternoon, Superintendent Pike returned to Ivy Cottage. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the slow administrative grind of wrapping up a case whose roots stretched too deep for a neat resolution. He declined tea for once, and stood by the fireplace instead, scanning the floral wallpaper, as though it might offer some final clarity. "We've completed the toxicology report," he said. "It confirms what we suspected. Digitalis, delivered in liquid form, likely added to Miss Arkwright's tonic bottle, which Farrow had access to after her maid left for the evening." Miss Marple gave a faint nod. "The Crown will proceed with charges. Manslaughter likely, maybe murder, if we can establish premeditation beyond doubt. But it'll be difficult. The confession from 1993 isn't admissible as evidence. The altered identity helps, but his barrister will argue psychological strain, even delusion." Miss Marple didn't look surprised. "The law is a net, Superintendent. It catches many things, but some creatures slip through." Pike's mouth twitched. "Still, you set the hook, and that's no small thing." He moved to leave, then paused at the door. "There's one thing I haven't told the papers." He said something small. After his arrest, Farrow asked only one question. Not about the charges, not about the evidence. Miss Marple tilted her head. He asked if she had said anything before she died, if Felicity spoke a name. There was a beat of silence. She hadn't, Miss Marple murmured, but that fear, that's what truly undid him. Pike left after that, and Miss Marple sat by the window with her embroidery untouched on her lap. She was thinking, not of the crime, but of the consequence, the sort of consequence that never made it into courtrooms or headlines. That evening, Mrs. Bletchley, the housekeeper, came to visit. She looked older somehow, shoulders rounded, voice quieter, I wanted to say. She began, sitting awkwardly, on the edge of the parlour chair. "I should have said something sooner about that night." Miss Marple let her speak. "I saw him, not clearly, but I heard the back door open after dark. I'd just gone, but I came back, forgot my scarf. The door was ajar. I thought she'd simply let it swing in the wind. I told myself it wasn't anything." "You were afraid," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Bletchley nodded. "I told myself it was nothing. That's the part I'll carry." Miss Marple reached across the table and offered a single comforting squeeze of her hand. "No one leaves a story untouched," she said. "We all cast shadows, some long, some short, but light always reveals them eventually." After the housekeeper left, Miss Marple stepped outside, her garden dark under the evening sky. A robin hopped along the fence, and in the distance the sound of Ruth's voice drifted faintly through an open window. She was speaking to the solicitor, arranging the legal steps for the trust, finalizing the donation of her aunt's estate. No bitterness, no triumph, only duty. The village had resumed its rhythm, but things had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but underneath, where memory lived and old wounds quietly throbbed. Miss Marple, gazing up at the first star above the hedgerow, knew that justice had been served, but at a cost. Felicity Arkwright would never see peace. Her final moments had been shaped by fear and silence. Giles Farrow would be tried, perhaps imprisoned, but the life lost could not be returned, nor the years of regret undone. And Ruth, though standing in the sunlight now, would carry with her the weight of inherited sorrow, not just loss, but a truth revealed too late to heal cleanly. In every village, Miss Marple thought, there are things buried under hedges and polite smiles. Some are crimes, others are simply truths no one dares to name. But this time the truth had been named, and it had changed everything. Chapter 12. A week after the inquest officially ruled Felicity Arkwright's death as homicide, the post arrived at Ivy Cottage with a quiet finality. The letter was official, thick paper, embossed seal. Miss Marple received it without ceremony, though her fingers paused a moment longer than usual before breaking the envelope's edge. Inside was a single page from the Home Office. The language was clipped, formal, and unemotional. The accused, Harold Glenister, operating under multiple aliases, including Giles Farrow and Giles Foster, has been formally charged with manslaughter, fraud, and obstruction of justice. A preliminary hearing is scheduled. The court acknowledges the unsolicited testimonial submitted by Miss Jane Marple of St. Aldhelms as contributing material to the Crown's case. Signed, E. Harrington, Office of Prosecution. Miss Marple folded the letter precisely and set it beside her saucer. That was that then. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten into a soft cloud-streaked blue. The village, too, was settling. There had been no dramatic declarations, no front-page headlines, just a subtle rearranging of the atmosphere. People spoke Miss Arkwright's name with a touch more respect now, and no one referred to Ruth as the niece any longer. She had become Ruth again, present, seen, accepted. Later that day, Miss Marple stepped into the vicarage with a basket of scones and a purpose. Reverend Hale was in the garden, hands deep in a patch of overgrown thyme. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, brushing his palms on his cassock, "you bring peace with you, as always." "Only scones, I'm afraid," she smiled, "though peace would be more lasting." They walked together to the vestry, where Mrs. Hale was tending to hymnals. There, Miss Marple made her quiet request. "Reverend," she began, "I believe it's time we returned something." He looked puzzled. "Returned?" "The entry," she clarified. "From Easter, 1993. The chapel logbook." Reverend Hale tilted his head. "You believe it should be restored?" "I believe truth shouldn't be left half-told," she said gently. "Miss Arkwright came here with a burden. She left no confession herself, but the record of that meeting, the visit from a man no one could trace, that was her first cry for justice. It should remain." The vicar nodded slowly. "Then it shall." They returned to the logbook and carefully rewrote the entry, preserving the original as closely as memory allowed. Easter Sunday, 1993. Special donation received. Private appointment, confessional. Visitor, Giles Farrow, alias confirmed. Witnessed by Miss Felicity Arkwright. Notes sealed by request. Reconfirmed 2025. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked back through the village with a sense of closure. Not satisfaction exactly, but something steadier, something earned. As she passed by the old mill house, she paused. A light was on in the side window, unusual as the property had been, empty for months. Curious but not alarmed, she continued along the path, and just as she rounded the corner, Ruth emerged from the garden gate. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "I didn't expect anyone today. I was taking the long way home." Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Stretching my legs." Ruth hesitated, then opened the gate fully. "Would you like to come in? I've decided to stay here for a while. It's small, but it's peaceful." The sitting room of the mill house was still bare in places, boxes stacked in corners, a kettle on a temporary stove. But there was already a sense of lived-in calm. Ruth moved easily now, without the stiffness she had carried those first few days. "I thought I might start a small reading group," she said, "for the village children, a kind of storytelling hour." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That would be just the thing. They sat by the window, the light slanting across the floor. "I've been thinking," Ruth said after a long pause. "My aunt never got to say everything. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's enough that someone finally listened." "She would have wanted you to stay," Miss Marple replied. "She was never warm, but I see her differently now." Miss Marple nodded. Understanding changes the shape of memory. There was a knock at the door just then, Mrs. Bletchley bearing a covered dish. "Chicken pie," she said, flustered. "I thought, well, it's nice to have something hot when you're settling in." Ruth blinked. "Thank you. That's very kind." Mrs. Bletchley hesitated. "She loved this house, you know. Miss Arkwright used to say she'd retire here once she made peace with things. I think she was trying to." Ruth's voice was steady. "Then maybe I will for both of us." Miss Marple excused herself soon after, leaving the two women in gentle conversation, the scent of pastry filling the small hallway. As she stepped out into the lane, a soft breeze carried the promise of late spring. The mystery had been solved, the danger past, but not every scar would vanish, nor should it. Some truths needed to remain, quiet, remembered and spoken aloud when the moment called for it. That was the final confirmation. Not a letter from the Crown, not an entry in a logbook, but the sound of two women sitting down together in a house once marked by silence, making something new. End of Chapter 12. Miss Marple and the Visitor Who Left Nothing. Complete.